I knew the twig would snap before my boot even touched the ground. I was standing at the bend in the trail, the sharp right turn around the old oak with the double trunk. I knew the layout of this section perfectly. I've walked it 1,000 times. But this wasn't memory. It was anticipation without the anxiety, a cold, hard certainty. I lifted my right foot to step onto the patch of dry branches hidden in the grass. Snap. The sound was sharp and loud, echoing off the hillside to my left. But I had stepped softly. I had barely put my weight down. The sound played a fraction of a second before my foot actually settled. I stopped walking. I stood on the trail, looking down at the broken twig. I felt a strange sensation in my stomach. Not fear, but recognition. A sense of, again. I've been here before, not on this trail, in this moment. I looked ahead. The trail stretched out, pale and gray in the moonlight. It looked like a strip of film unspooling in front of me. I took another step. Crunch. I heard the gravel shift before I shifted my weight. I exhaled. I saw the breath fog in the air. I heard the hiss of the breath before I actually exhaled. The timeline was collapsing. The effect was preceding the cause. I am familiar with the ridge trail. I know the silence that lives here. I know the way the sound cuts out when you stand still, like the world is holding its breath. But this was different. This wasn't just the world reacting to me. This was the world reciting lines it had memorized. I started walking again. I kept my pace, slow, deliberate. I tried to focus on the feeling of the ground under my feet, the friction, the solidity, step, crunch, step, crunch. The rhythm was perfect, too perfect. I passed the second landmark, the fallen log that lies across the path. I knew without checking that the moss on the underside of the log was damp. I knew there was a beetle living under the bark near the third branch from the left. I didn't look. I didn't need to. I kept walking. I reached the clearing, the part of the trail where the trees open up and you can see the valley below. The highway noise is usually loudest here, a low, constant rumble. I stopped walking. The highway noise cut out instantly. The silence slammed down like a heavy door. But I didn't feel surprised. I felt like I had just read a sentence I already knew by heart. I stood there. I looked at the sky. The moon was fixed in position, a pale coin. I waited for the thought to come. It feels like they're watching. The thought arrived in my head, clear, distinct. And immediately, the sensation of being watched washed over me. The prickle on the back of my neck. The tightness in my chest. But the thought hadn't felt like mine. It felt like a prompt. I realized then that the events were compressing. Usually there is a gap. I stop. The silence falls. I wait. I feel uneasy. Then I start walking again. Tonight, there was no gap. I stopped. The silence hit. The thought arrived and the sensation hit. All in the same second. The loop was tightening. I started walking again. I wanted to get to the creek. The water sound was real. It wasn't generated. It was fluid physics. Step, step, step. I walked faster. I heard a twig snap ahead of me. I hadn't stepped on it. It was up the trail. I looked up. I saw the shadow detach itself from the tree line, just for a split second. A darker patch of black against the night. It vanished, but I knew where it went. It went behind the oak tree, the third one down. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to confirm it. But my neck turned. My head swiveled to the left. I looked right at the oak tree. Nothing was there. But the thought came again. It's moving closer. I felt a spike of adrenaline. My heart rate jumped. I walked faster. I was almost jogging now. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sounds of my footsteps were overlapping. The crunch of the gravel wasn't sinking with my feet anymore. It was just a constant track of noise playing underneath me. I reached the creek. The water was flowing. I could hear it rushing over the rocks. I stopped on the bridge. The water sound cut out. Silence. The thought arrived. Don't look down. I looked down. The water was frozen, a static gray texture. It wasn't moving. I gripped the railing of the bridge. The wood was smooth. Too smooth. It felt like plastic. I looked up. The trees on the other side of the creek were flickering. Not like a light bulb flickers, like a video buffer. They were rendering at a lower resolution, then snapping back to high definition, then dropping again. I took a step forward. The bridge creaked. Creak! The sound stretched out. It warped. It slowed down, deepening in pitch, like a cassette tape eating itself. I ran across the bridge. I needed to get to the other side. I needed to get off the ridge trail. My feet hit the dirt on the far bank. I heard the sound of dirt hitting dirt. But I was 10 feet away from the sound. The echo was leading me. I stopped. The sound of my footsteps continued for 2 more steps. Thud, thud. Then it stopped. I stood there. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I looked around. The forest was waiting. It was in a standby mode. I tried to formulate a plan. I tried to think about the route home. I will turn left at the next junction, I thought. Before I even moved my legs, the environment shifted. The path to the left lit up. The moonlight seemed to focus on that specific trail. The path to the right darkened. It dissolved into shadow. The forest was reading my input. I didn't turn left. I stood still. I thought about going right. The right path lit up. The left path vanished. It wasn't just predicting me. It was generating the world based on my intention. I felt a wave of nausea. I'm not a person exploring a place. I'm a cursor moving across a map, and the map is drawing itself just inches in front of my face. I took a step backward. The trail behind me disappeared. It turned into a gray void. I couldn't go back. I had to go forward. I started walking again. I focused on the mechanics of my movement. Lift knee, extend foot, shift weight, step, step, step. I tried to clear my mind. I tried not to think about where I was going. I tried to think about nothing, just the color blue, just a blank wall. The forest around me blurred. The trees lost their detail. They became brown and green smudges. I was walking through a sketch. I kept my mind blank. The path became a straight line. The obstacles, the rocks, the roots, the branches, they stopped appearing. I was walking in a smooth gray tube. I let myself think about the parking lot. Instantly, the gray tube vanished. I was standing at the edge of the asphalt. My car was there. The transition was jarring. No time had passed. I didn't remember walking the last mile. I was just there. I looked at my watch. It was 8:15 p.m. I had left the house at 8 p.m. The hike takes 40 minutes. I looked at the car. The engine was cold. I walked to the driver's side door. I reached for the handle. The door was already unlocked. I got in. I sat in the seat. I didn't start the car. I just sat there. I looked at the steering wheel. I looked at the dashboard. I felt a strange sensation, a sensation of latency. I moved my hand to the ignition. My hand moved, but I felt the resistance a fraction of a second later. The texture of the plastic didn't register until my skin was already pressing against it. The lag was getting worse. I turned the key. The engine started. Vroom. The sound came from the speakers. It didn't come from the engine block. I shifted into drive. I pulled out of the parking spot. I drove down the mountain road. The headlights cut through the darkness. I saw a deer standing on the shoulder of the road. I braked. My foot slammed the pedal. The car slowed down. but the deer didn't move. It was frozen. As I passed it, I looked in the rearview mirror. The deer was gone. It hadn't walked away. It had just despawned. I kept driving. I reached the highway. I merged into traffic. The other cars were moving perfectly. They were keeping perfect distance, perfect speed. They were NPC traffic. I looked at the driver in the red sedan next to me. He was facing forward. His hands were at 10 and 2. He didn't blink. I sped up. I wanted to get home. I wanted to get inside my house and lock the door. I took the exit for my neighborhood. I drove down the quiet streets. I pulled into my driveway. I turned off the car. Silence. I sat there for a moment. I looked at the front door of my house. The light on the porch was on. I didn't leave it on. I got out of the car. I walked to the door. I unlocked it. I stepped inside. I locked the door behind me. I leaned back against the wood. I exhaled. I was safe. The house smelled right. It smelled like coffee and laundry detergent. I walked into the living room. I sat on the sofa. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 8:45 p.m. I had been home for 5 minutes, but I didn't remember driving the last 2 miles. I sat on the sofa, and I tried to relax. I looked at the coffee table. There was a magazine on it. The cover was facing down. I knew what the cover was. It was a picture of a mountain, a snow-capped peak. I didn't remember buying the magazine, but I knew the image. I reached out to flip it over. Before my fingers touched the paper, I saw the image in my mind. Snow, peak, blue sky. I flipped the magazine. It was the picture I knew. I pulled my hand back. I felt the same cold certainty I had on the trail. I am in a loop. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water. I knew the water would be cold. I drank it. It was cold. I put the glass in the sink. Clink. The sound played before the glass hit the bottom of the sink. I froze. I was standing in my kitchen, the safe zone, but the mechanics had followed me. I looked at the window above the sink. It was dark outside. I saw my reflection in the glass. I raised my hand to wave. The reflection waved before I did. I lowered my hand. The reflection lowered its hand a split second later. It was mimicking me, but it was ahead of me. I turned away from the window. I walked back to the living room. I sat on the sofa again. I tried to think of something new, something the sequence couldn't predict. I tried to think of a word, a random word. Banana. I thought it. The word appeared in my head, but it didn't feel like I generated it. It felt like it was displayed there, like a subtitle. I tried to think of another word, radiator. It appeared. I tried to think of a face, a stranger's face. I couldn't see it. I just saw a gray placeholder, a silhouette. My imagination was empty. I couldn't create anything new. I could only access the files that had already been loaded. I sat there in the silence of my living room. The silence was the same as the forest silence, heavy, pressing. I realized I wasn't safe. I had just reached the end of the level. I waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I knew it was coming. The reset. I looked at the front door. The lock turned. Click. I hadn't touched it. The deadbolt slid back. The door opened a crack. Darkness was outside, not the night sky, just absolute void. I stood up. I walked to the door. I wasn't afraid. I was curious. I reached for the handle. As I touched it, I felt a sensation of déjà vu so strong it made my knees buckle. I knew what was on the other side. I didn't open the door. I closed it. I locked the deadbolt again. I walked back to the sofa. I sat down. I closed my eyes. I am tired. I thought. The thought was correct, but I didn't feel tired. I felt buffered. I opened my eyes. The clock on the wall said 8 p.m. I was back at the start of the loop. But I wasn't on the trail. I was in my living room. The sequence had changed location. That was the only difference. I looked at the magazine on the table. The cover was facing up now. It was a picture of a forest, the Ridge Trail. I stood up. I knew I was going to walk out the door. I knew I was going to get in the car. I knew I was going to drive to the trail. I didn't want to, but I could feel the inputs pressing against my muscles. The narrative was pulling me forward. I reached for my keys on the hook. They were already in my hand. I hadn't picked them up. I looked at the keys. The metal was warm. I put them in my pocket. I walked to the door. I unlocked it. I opened it. The forest was outside, not the street. The forest. The trees were pressing against the porch. The dirt was covering the sidewalk. The loop had expanded. It had consumed the context. I stepped out. Snap. The twig broke under my foot. I had finally caught up to the sound. I smiled. It was easier this way. When you stop fighting the prediction, there is no lag. There is no delay. I walked down the trail. I knew exactly what was coming next. And the best part was, I didn't have to remember why.